Hi. Hi, we're going to start now. If everyone could silence their phones and their neighbors, that would be great. Thank you, thank you. Welcome to the fourth installment of our spring lecture series on architecture and landscape. I'm Zach Posner, Director of Architecture in the Stanford University Architect's Office. It's not my mom, it's not my mom. Good friend, good friend. Okay. Firstly, I want to apologize on behalf of Odile Deck, who was originally supposed to be our speaker tonight. Unfortunately, she is occupied overseas with project commitments this week. But we are extremely grateful to have Clive Wilkinson here tonight, who was actually my first choice anyway. He initially turned me down, and then, when we were in a bind, he filled in adequately tonight. So his work is even better than Odile's, and his hair is even cooler. And if you guys haven't seen what Odile Deck looks like, please Google it. It's fantastic. I saw Clive speak at Monterey Design Conference last year, and that was my introduction to him, and I was really inspired by the enormous intellect and creativity that he and his colleagues bring to every project they do. And we are really fortunate to be working with him and his team right now on 650,000 square feet of workplace for the administrative staff at Stanford's new campus in Redwood City. And a lot of the team is here tonight. I want to thank Dave Lennox, Sarah Jacobs, and Padma Kuditi-Pudi from our office, as well as John Barton, the director of the Stanford Architectural Design Program, for organizing this series. We are honored to have such outstanding professionals join us this spring. I would like to thank the American Institute of Architects, Santa Clara Valley chapter, for their help in advertising the series and registering our program for continuing education credits. If you haven't done so, please sign up outside with Padma and get your credits. Our next lecture is in 2 weeks, right here, with Greg Pasquarelli from SHOP, very good architecture firm. It's going to be right here in Bishop Auditorium on a Thursday night, so please make a note of that and tell your friends. The theme for this year's series is Live, Work, Play. A cultural shift is clearly well underway, where the boundaries between these three phases of the conventional working day have been eroded. Some would argue that there is no such thing as a work-life balance anymore because a growing portion of the modern workforce does not distinguish between work and life. And that's evidenced across the hall where there's a lab open till midnight with students jam-packed into it. We've asked our speakers to reflect on how their work addresses this evolution. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Clive Wilkinson. Clive Wilkinson, FAIA, RIBA, is an architect and strategist working at the intersection of urban design, architecture, and interior design. His Los Angeles-based practice has designed large-scale projects for Google, Nokia, JWT, FIDM, Disney, and Macquarie Bank, establishing new paradigms for building creative and educational communities. While innovative in its architecture, his design process is primarily focused on the social agenda of buildings and how people connect with each other, very similar to what we do here at Stanford. Clive was born in South Africa and educated in the United Kingdom. His practice, Clive Wilkinson Architects, was established in 1991 and is an acknowledged global leader in workplace design, with over 100 design awards to its credit. Clive was inducted into the Interior Design Hall of Fame in 2005. He was nominated a Master of Design by Fast Company magazine in 2006, and a Pioneer of Design by IIDA in 2011. From being finalists in the National Design Awards in 2010 and 2011, his firm won the 2012 Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt Design Museum National Design Award for Excellence in Interior Design. He has served as a keynote speaker at global media, advertising, and design conferences, and has contributed to radio and television shows on architecture and design affairs. Please give a warm Stanford welcome to Clive Wilkinson.
Thanks, Zach. Thank you. Big honor to be here. This is such a famous institution. I'm a little overwhelmed. I have quite an extensive presentation, and I'm a little concerned that it'll come across as a kind of a cloudburst of ideas that are unresolved. But I do think it's important, and I'm sure a lot of academics amongst you think it's very important, the questions rather than the answers, because it's the questions that I think keep us engaged in the process. We got into the area of workplace and interior design rather by accident about 25 years ago when the firm was started. It was really ad agencies that taught us how important interior environments were to the creative process. And of course, ad agencies live and die by ideas, so they took particular interest in the kinds of environments that their people worked in. Anyway, I'll jump in and talk about a whole lot of things. And I wish this were interactive, actually. You could all interrupt and say that's wrong and things like that. But we have a reverence for the city, primarily as a kind of a shared language that everyone relates to. And this happens to be London around 1600. And the texture and the kind of the network of the city is something I think kind of in everyone's memory, and therefore makes it valuable for architects to refer to in their work for people. So the city is the theatre of life. And what I want to talk about today is the theatre of work. We like to think that the workplace has an immense potential that's been very much untapped for how people and communities can really energize themselves and work together and share ideas and cause interactions that create amazing things. This is actually not a staged picture. This is a bunch of students in our Richmond, Virginia advertising school that we did a few years ago. Actually, this room's kind of interesting because the room actually folds away up to the ceiling and disappears. But what's really interesting is that this really is what we're talking about. This is the theatre that workplace environments can become. How people use them, how they relax into them, how their body language works, how all of those messages that are communicated physically rather than in more attenuated means like digitally and et cetera, et cetera. That is super valuable. So, theatre is the amplification of human life, the re-energizing of memory and experience, and the reawakening of passion. I was wondering whether to jump reading this quote from Antonin Artaud, but it really is beautiful. Theatre takes images and develops them to the limit. It reforges the links between what does and does not exist in material nature. It rediscovers the idea of figures and archetypal symbols, which act like sudden silences, fermata, heart stops, adrenaline calls, incendiary images surging into our abruptly awoken minds. That's written, I think, probably around 1950. So architecture frames the theatre of human experience. And to become theatre, building designs must address community structures, knowledge sharing, diversity, choice and opportunity, tribal organization and connectivity, and the concept of theatre and stage and auditorium. And we've come a long way. I don't know how familiar everyone is with where the workplace was 100 years ago or even earlier. But there was a whole sort of science of organization of people, which actually used the factory processes and Taylorist thinking to organize the way in which people would work to make them as productive as possible, with very little concern to their real well-being and health. And that pattern really ended up with the workplace of the very recent past, cubicle land, Dilbert land, the idea of control and management and all the rest. And then there's also these other parallel things like the floor of a stock exchanges where they actually work far more like medieval marketplaces. And then the thinking of the cubicle land and the sort of bizarreness of the workplace kind of culminated in this image from '67 from Jacques Tati's film Playtime, which is really kind of amazing, where the private office has become something incredibly introverted. And in fact, it's organized itself almost on a grid-like pattern, as if it's becoming a new type of village. And indeed, there's motorized people in tiny vehicles for communication. So we've gone through these phases over the last few hundred years. I think, as everyone knows, up until around about the late 1700s, we had an agricultural economy primarily. It was rural, it was family-oriented, it was fundamentally immobile. People didn't move around much, and it was climate influenced. And then we've gone through industrial, urban manpower, stationary, linear process, to the service industry. It was interesting enough, I think 1921 was the peak year when the service industry actually overtook the industrial base in numerical terms. And so it became more increasingly suburban, about brain power to some extent, increased mobility and a demand-oriented process. And we think we don't really know what we call this economy today, but for lack of another word, idea economy, which is both global and local, networked, increasingly unlimited mobility, and it's all around innovation. So that's changed massively, and the workplace itself is still strangely oriented in the same way as it was in the previous era. And what's even more amazing is that your options have historically been so limited. You have an open desk or you have a private office. And if you think about the parallel to our homes, to residences, and you think of the complexity of rooms that make up a residence and of what we expect out of a home, and you compare it to an office where you're spending really the same amount of time, perhaps more in an office, it's amazing how little thought has gone into this area. So, and we've moved from being bound by paper to being released by technology, and this is almost completely true, I think. And in years, paper is really going to be a kind of a relic. And there's also a history around workplaces, which is fascinating as well. The image on the left is St. Jerome in his study, a 600 or so AD religious man, writer and scholar, and as envisaged by, forgive me for not remembering the name and the date, but something around the 1400s by an early Renaissance painter. And this image is kind of absolutely wonderful, not just because of its curiosities, but because it essentially is a book. This contains so many symbolic references that you could write a book about that one image. And that tells you something about the richness of life and as it was perceived back then. And then, somewhat ironically, to the right, that's the first mobile, almost first mobile working environment in 1995, Shite Day in Los Angeles, where many of the things that they had figured out were working, but then so many of them were not, like the fact that chair is fundamentally bad for your posture and uncomfortable. The orientation to your work surface is kind of something that doesn't work properly, etc., etc. But it looks cool. And this actually, curiously enough, the failure of this particular example of mobile working back in '95 had everything to do with the fact that it was way too much ahead of its time. Had it happened today, technology would have facilitated it, but back then it couldn't, and people were literally using the trunks of their cars as filing cabinets. So statistically, we see that routine work and non-routine work have kind of switched around. Non-routine work has become increasingly prevalent, and routine work is declining. Computers obviously are taking over the role that humans were doing before. And we've moved through different types of concepts of the workplace, where the individual took up the 70% of the space, group work averaged around 30%, and a strong division between the two, to where we are today, where group work is prioritized, and of course it should be prioritized because knowledge sharing is absolutely crucial to the survival of businesses today. And there's a blurred boundary to individual work, which is still very important, of course, because people need to concentrate, but it's given less emphasis. And moving to kind of a concept of one community for every institution or business, that is so important to prioritize the connectivity between all people. So what factors shape the new workplace? We think there are a number of issues, and some of them which are never really talked about. The culture model is one of the most complicated ones, and it's not talked about much. So we'll jump into that. The urban paradigm and its meaning. And then more obvious things like fluidity and transparency within the workplace, disruption and play, choice and diversity, and human scale, community and collaboration. So we are, in the culture model, we are moving from a previous era that was fundamentally mature to a much more open and naive and immature system. We have a convergence of cultural aspirations today. Happening simultaneously, we have a convergence of commercial aspirations, which are much more messy and untethered within the urban environment. And we find this kind of comparison really interesting. Marie Antoinette on the left and some young girl of today on the right, both of them exhibiting their values through their dress. And one of the most kind of interesting things about them is that Marie Antoinette has grey hair. Why does Marie Antoinette have grey hair? She has grey hair because in that era, power resided with age. It was the rich old people who really ran the place, who were the major consumers, the major purchasing power, et cetera, et cetera. So it was cool to look old. It's really kind of fascinating. That paradigm has completely reversed itself, where for all sorts of reasons, it's cool to be young today, no matter how old you are. And so that's also the difference between the mature and the immature. I think this is actually, it's obviously very Versailles influence, but I think it's actually in St. Petersburg, Russia. And on the right is a project that we did for Disney, which all had a lot to do with storing, it was Disney Store, storing their products because they produced a huge number of products in the process of creating them. And that's a meeting room that's largely surrounded by the honeycombs that we made. The urban paradigm, as I said before, the importance of this, the language of the city, and how today so many of the key words that we use in designing workplace environments really refer back to and embedded within the historical city. This happens to be the plan of, and it's a little bit like a small city in itself, of the project that sort of launched our firm back in 1998. TBWA Shire Day, the largest ad agency on the West Coast. Their previous building had been a Frank Gehry building, the binocular building, and they outgrew that. They also had been gone through the mobile office experiment and hadn't worked out, but they'd learned a lot of lessons from that. And they were an incredibly intelligent client. We were incredibly lucky to win this project, where the goal was to create this kind of village and treat the neighborhoods around it almost like a kind of an agriculture around a main street spine. That was the first sketch of the outside. It was just a big, huge old factory box, and they asked us what we could do to kind of animate that, thinking that we would, add windows and change the structure. But because it was a seismic zone, you couldn't do very much with the existing building, and we had that money placed on something completely separate from the building as a kind of gatehouse structure, a way of entering into the box and distracting you from the dullness of the box. And that's one of the first images you get as you enter. We were lucky enough to design the workstations as well. And Main Street, gosh, it is very vivid. I think it's a little more vivid than reality. The creative, these are actually were known as the cliff dwellings. The creative teams would work on either side, and then there was a little park in the middle, and a basketball court in the end. So there were a lot of things that represented a much more generous attitude towards their staff, And this, what's really great about this project is it's still in existence. It's 17 years later, and it's still working pretty much exactly as it was back then. They have some rules about when you can play a basketball and how big a team can be during the middle of the day for disruption reasons. And that's the workstation design we did, because everything in those days was cubicles back in 1998. No one made anything else. And so we came up with a product that we patented and sold the rights to Steelcase, and they manufactured it. And a lot of very simple concepts, like that whole curve is based on the sweep of a hand across the desk. That's a little Central Park in the middle. And jumping to a project we have under construction right now in Los Angeles. So this is a lot later. And it's a little bit accidental that there's a lot of yellow on this one as well. We had to do with a very limited palette in the cement boards that we were offered. But this is also a kind of a mixed thing where we renovated an existing building. The existing parking on the site was recombined into a big parking structure. We added an extension, and we have a new building for KCRW, the radio station that's super popular down in Los Angeles, and part of the college. So there's also a nice aspect to this where it moves from conventional teaching through a certain kind of production facility related to the teaching, and then the example of real life broadcasting, and the students are really exposed to all of this in one campus. So that's really quite wonderful. And the courtyard that got formed by the configuration is really great for different kinds of events. We're hoping this is actually going to finish by the end of this year. And on an urban scale as well, BMW invited us to look at their headquarters in Munich, amongst several other firms, and how we could actually create a massive increase in their office and production facility. That was a great fun, that project. I think we went a little too far for BMW. And the idea of a village can also run vertically through a building. So this was a project we did for Macquarie Bank, an Australian bank in London, their London headquarters, where they rented a conventional office building and decided themselves that they would bash a hole through all 6 floors and do a great connected atrium, because of how important it was that the different business groups on different floors would actually connect with each other. And potentially, leverage synergies between their businesses, that's this staircase ran all the way through it, and people ended up by using the staircase for moving between floors far more than they did elevators. So it was really quite great to see. I think it's 7 floors. We reused a lot of the existing structure. Actually, we cut out structure on the floors. We actually reused it to form the new elements that popped into that space. And that's a view from the meeting room at the top, looking down. More conventional notions, but still very, very important, about fluidity and transparency. Buildings need to be incredibly sensible in the way in which they work. Movement needs to be incredibly intuitive and easy, and then only from that basic functional pragmatic point do you really have license to explore other things. And this is the sort of horrendous thing that we try to get away from as much as possible and open up buildings. That's actually the Googleplex over there, which we did manage to open up a lot. And I think this is very much part of our future, and it's kind of exciting, even though it seems very old. The idea of being super mobile. We did this project for a very conventional firm in New York, kind of a financial firm called GLG, who had a lot of client events happening on their premises, and they were very open to a new way of working. So this is, and I'm going to show you a video in a moment about activity-based working, where it's like mobile working 2.0. It's highly supported by a whole range of work settings which are strategically placed around the office to encourage their use, and it results in a very interesting workspace. And this is pretty cool because it was a very conventional firm. And we cut a hole to create an atrium, and actually lifted up the roof of it as well, and created a whole new skylight. So it's got a great central space which brought natural light into a very deep plan. We like very deep plans because that means that everyone's on one level, and one can get the sort of synergies between people going. And other sort of very simple things, but which are super important, having a very good barista bar right on the edge of that atrium, creating a kind of a hub in the middle of the building, which is also working as a sort of a social condenser. It really is extraordinary that for the last few hundred years, the only option about how to work or where to work has been a desk or an office. This is about 5 minutes, so forgive me, but I think it's quite important.
The new physical environment has totally transformed not only the way people work, but the way people feel about their work. We didn't know we wanted activity-based working. As a matter of fact, we had never heard of activity-based working.
ABW is activity-based working, and it's a new form of working that's about activating your workplace in a whole new dynamic way. It's about empowering workers, it's about giving a range of choice and opportunity to people, and essentially changing the dynamics of human relationships in your workplace.
There's no office boundary, there's no voicemail boundary, so everyone that's in the room together is working together. So it's ultimate collaboration. And now that we can be so mobile that technology has taken a back seat from what we do and can facilitate our work instead of drive it, we can go back to the importance of thinking and communication.
So our goal is to change the way professionals learn, and we do that by scaling one-to-one learning. We think that learning needs to change for all levels of people, actually, but we're just having to focus on the professional segment. And in the professional segment, professional learning takes place, in our mind, one-on-one. It takes place when you can learn from someone directly who understands the material you're trying to learn in an interactive environment. And so in order to pursue the kind of teaching and learning we want to pursue, we host lots of meetings, thousands and thousands all over the world. And after 15 years, we've never hosted a single meeting in a GLG office. And we decided to bring most of those meetings into our space, and that required a pretty different type of architecture.
So we were on this learning journey with Clive and his team, and discovered that there was this big idea that people could work in an environment that provided an entirely new variety of working environments, where you could work at a table, you could work in a conference room, you could work in a phone booth, you could work in a more living room atmosphere, you could be with groups of people making a lot of noise, you could go off and be quiet by yourself somewhere. That all of these options were available to us through ABW, through activity-based working.
And then you may also have a situation where somebody just comes to the cafe because they want to grab a cup of coffee, they're sitting out in the open, maybe at one of the diner-style booths or one of the couches. That in and of itself invites collaboration, right? Saying, I'm in an open space, I'm open to engage with others, really tells people that you're ready to collaborate. Now, if I don't want to, I go into a phone booth, right? If I don't want to, maybe I'm sitting in a private area in the office that just gives me a chance to concentrate on my own things. But lots of opportunity to collaborate in many different ways, in many different fashions.
And so it makes it natural to have events around you while you're working, and it makes you're able to use space that you would never normally use. So we're able to use our atrium space for an event while people are working right next door, which you never be able to do that before. You would need walls and you would need sound barriers, and here we don't need that because of the way that the space has been designed and the way that the acoustics have been designed. We can host events in our general spaces while people are still working and not disrupt work, but also make for an interesting backdrop to what we do, which is technology-enabled connections.
As people are moving through the office, they see this collaboration happening, they can join, they can see what's going on. And again, it creates this open communication that wasn't in our previous office. Those were always closed door meetings because that's where the technology was. It was behind the doors. So we've pulled that out onto the floor to allow people to move around and work in a very open and mobile fashion. Anywhere you take your laptop, your phone goes with you. So when you pop over to the cafe to have a coffee break and you have your laptop with you and your phone rings, it's there with you. You don't miss the call because it's back at your desk. And everybody has the wireless headsets that enable them to then be mobile from their laptop. So now you can move with your laptop into the cafe, the phone can ring, and you can get up and leave your laptop there and pop into a phone booth. And by doing that, you've become exceptionally mobile, and you have an opportunity to really use the whole space as it's designed.
We get, thousands of calls a day from our clients trying to solve their biggest concerns or help them with an issue that they want answered or insight into something they're looking for. And the point is if we were able to get one person over here who's really good in healthcare, one person over here who's really good in chemical goods and industrials, you put them together and they start talking. And we weren't doing that in our old office. But now we have a space where that just happens naturally. And whether it be on my creative team or whether it be with the team leaders here or with our practice areas, it's just flourishing. Every day somebody new is visiting, and it's like almost like we've opened our doors to everybody, and the communication is just flowing. And it's gonna tap into ROI. Guarantee you that we're getting more projects in from clients because they're coming to visit our space and they're meeting other people that they normally don't meet when they're having a conversation on a phone, and that's really helping us.
And it's changed the density issue in the workplace, because you can now, instead of having a 40 to 60% occupancy rate, you can shift that rate up to 80% with a small redundancy rate to ensure that there are always open desks. And you can run this office with a new level of buzz and mobility and fluidity in the way in which people are using space. And I think GLG is a fantastic example of that, where you can really see a workplace in action in a very kind of highly visible, highly transparent way. So this is an odd diagram that we generated in our early days to look at the use of open space within buildings. And we took the example, this is 1988, of that happened to be Anderson Consulting's offices in Chicago, regarded as state-of-the-art at the time. And that red thing, which we like to call a racetrack running around the outside, is the circulation corridor, and every senior person has an office up against the window. And it's a very simplistic environment where very little can happen in terms of synergies. A massive amount of barriers and lack of space for opportunities. And this plan over here is digital studios that we did for 20th Century Fox 10 years later, where we really looked at all of the open space, or potentially open space, as an opportunity for places that people could congregate, could hang out, could have meetings, could really enliven corridor areas and widen them out and turn them into really useful things. Because this diagram over here, there's a bit of data collection that happened in the 90s, indicated that people were away from their desks in offices for a phenomenal percentage of the day, simply not at their desks. And that's what I was referring to in the previous, in the video, that occupancy rates were typically around 40 to 60%. 40% of a typical workplace is empty all the time when you own your own desk. And it's a fact of life. So that's a massive amount of wasted real estate, but also in parallel, it's the reason that so many workplaces are so dead. The energy level is so low. And that's something we really want to challenge. This is a project we did for a very interesting one for an ad agency called Mother in London about 10 years ago, where they wanted to have everyone around a single table. So we did a table for 200 people, and we made it out of concrete. which is the sort of ultimate irony for a business that's so ephemeral, or about ephemera as an ad agency. But they loved the idea. And we based it on the Turin racetrack from the 1920s, which was kind of a great but slightly ridiculous image. It just happened to fit well in the space. and that's also proved to be very successful and become very much part of their brand. Disruption and play. So another thing we learned very early on, and actually it was Jay Shyatt, who was this really brilliant ad man way back in 1990. I can't remember what question I was exactly that I asked him, but his answer was, I don't want people to be comfortable. I want them to be provoked. And that was his brief to us as designers for his workspace. And it had me thinking about, this is so true. Why on earth would you want people to be so comfortable that they would go to sleep in the workplace? That doesn't make sense. But that was the paradigm of the time. Everyone was designing for comfort. Disruption and play, the idea of serious play, I think are fundamental attributes of a real creative workplace. Why? Because creativity definitely flourishes in a condition of play. It is really about play. The act of being creative is about the act of being playful. and small differences make a huge difference. Small things make a huge difference. It's the same letters, just slightly differently organized. This is back in the Disney Store headquarters. They wanted to have a space for gathering 200 people together, but they didn't really want to give up the real estate for that. So we had an area adjacent to the cafe and their main conference room where we created the wall of the main conference room out of these foam blocks, and then you could take the foam blocks down and they became seats for all the people. And it took 20 minutes for a couple of people to put the wall back. And that was quite successful. Actually, there you see it kind of in context. That's the wall over there that is removable. And walls can be soft as well. We first got into soft walls because we had budget problems, and it was cheaper to make walls out of fabric than to build them out of drywall. And then we started having more fun with them. And in this case, JWT, J. Walter Thompson in New York, had a whole business purpose around storytelling. So we used the first lines of famous novels and cut them into the fabric of their various meeting rooms. Another project that we really loved was Pilota Teamworks back in 2003, where the client had almost no money at all. But we found that by using very inexpensive things, shipping containers purchased at $3,400 a piece, and tent structures, together we could accommodate them within a very large warehouse. And there's a backstory here too, where they didn't have enough money to air condition the whole building, and this system allowed them to air condition just a part of the building and let the rest of the building be warmer. So it was also very good from a carbon footprint point of view. And because shipping containers make lousy offices by themselves, we cut holes in them and created these little porches on the sides of them, which changed the nature of the space within the container. It's now used as a school, which is really great for kids. Choice and diversity. So something that we've been continuously working with our clients about how to move away from this simplistic notion of a desk and the territorial ownership of a desk, when a workspace can be so much more, can be about so much more. This was actually our image that we used to persuade Nokia in Helsinki to move away from this model into something much more diverse, because they had at the time, this is 2007, they had an ad talking about their phones as being not one thing but many. So we used the same line and talked to them about their workplace becoming that too, and they were like, oh, maybe we should. And that's Google, the model that we did for the Googleplex back in 2004. And that was all about how to create movement in a main street, but then also to protect the concentrated work areas from noise and disruption. So we ran through a whole process of layering constraints and opportunities. even down to how can a building perform beyond the normal workday? What does it mean when when people are spending much more time there? How does the building actually react to that? It needs to become part of the program of the building. And we looked at the notion of acoustic heat contours. So how we could actually control the buzz that's very necessary within buildings, but actually screen it away from the quiet concentration zones around the outsides. And we proposed and instituted 13 different types of work settings, collaboration settings really. And they had also been just about one desk and one office prior to this. Making these rooms around the perimeter was actually the most fun. They're all glass because we really wanted the people who worked inboard not to have their light and view taken away from them. But because of the acoustics within an all glass space, we needed a highly absorbent ceiling. So we created these custom-made acoustic tents, which are stretched up, and they have all their services sort of coming through a collar in the middle of them, and that gave the room the sort of absorption it needed. Something else that we feel is vital for people to understand about their own businesses is what is the day in the life of an employee. And if it is just about going to a desk and sitting there all day, other than taking a lunch break, maybe there's a way of thinking about it in a much healthier fashion, which is about physical movement around the workplace more, about interacting with people more and achieving variety. And through that, you'll have much more motivated and engaged staff. We did this for a project for Macquarie Bank in Australia, which was the first activity-based working project. This is a plan from that. It was a 10-story building, quite a large community of 3,000 people. And each neighborhood, there were 5 neighborhoods per floor of 100 people per floor. And these are all unowned desks, but they all function in slightly different ways. Some are perfect for 2-person meetings, and various different types of collaboration. This thing is perfect for like 4 or 5 people sharing a monitor. The blue elements in the middle are what's called anchor points, and the anchor points are the sort of the functional hub of a 100-person community. So they contain personal lockers for everyone. They contain things like Xerox machines and fax machines, although these are increasingly not used because there was a massive movement to get rid of paper. But coat storage and other stuff like that. The concept for the main space in the building was really quite fun. The building wasn't built when we started in 2006, so we had an opportunity to influence the interior, and it was a long, thin interior. So we first proposed the bank because there was adjacent shipping container work on the harbour. It was right next to this in Darling Harbour, right next to the harbour in Sydney. So we proposed this idea of putting gantries down the middle of this long atrium and being able to very easily containerize meeting rooms and then deliver them like if you could be on the 4th floor and you say, I want a 10-person meeting room, it gets delivered to you and clicks onto the floor. and the client was bewildered but excited. And unfortunately, they came back to us 2 weeks later and they said, the only thing in the building we don't want to be movable is the meeting rooms. But the aesthetic actually remained, which was kind of fun. We had sort of locked in this idea, and there are 26 of these different meeting rooms scattered throughout the 10-story atrium. And what's particularly lovely about them is they're extremely open and transparent. And when they are in use, you're seeing all these meetings going on, and it kind of celebrates a culture of collaboration, right at the forefront. The message to their clients and visitors is a very powerful one about, we're all about human communities and meeting. View from high up. And what was really also great about it was that we could actually create a bank that was highly transparent, completely counter to its culture, which is all about kind of secrecy and the sort of safety and security thing, without having any kind of compromise, because the distances that across the atrium were such that you could never read anything that was on anyone's computer screen. So clients could get the sense that they could really feel the energy of a bank without ever knowing what was going on in detail. How am I doing? Human scale, community, and collaboration. This is the final one. And we find a huge difference between small communities and large companies. Huge difference. Small communities act like extended families, fundamentally. Everyone knows everyone else to a certain extent. They operate on a sort of a network of trust. They simply don't have the problems that large communities have, where alienation and the sense of being a tiny cog in a massive wheel, a machine, create all sorts of problems. And way back in 99, Wired's offices in San Francisco had this very, very open kind of doors on trestles kind of thing. Fantastic flexibility, but also a complete lack of clarity about relationships and departments and orientation and all the rest. So we took that and we said, well, if we could have more definition around neighborhoods, which gives people a sense of manageable kind of chaos rather than unmanageable chaos, we can also look at how to retain flexibility and allow neighborhoods to flow into each other. So when a group expands or contracts, there's that flexibility between them. And we applied that in the thinking of planning Shiat Day back in 1999. And that's one of those things that we do in all of our planning to ensure that we don't create silos. Now, I'm going to go into this project in a little more detail because it's kind of very interesting. We did this project called the Superdesk in New York a few years ago. Again, an ad agency. In a way, it's kind of an exploration beyond the big concrete table we did for Mother. They had 125 people, and we pitched this idea about everyone working around a big desk, and they were cool about it. And what we didn't want to do this time was to break the desk for circulation, because this is actually the size of this desk is actually 4,400 square foot of desk area, so it gets pretty large. But we like to compare it to what would it look like if everyone had their own desk. Well, that's what it looks like with everyone having their own desk. That's what it looks like when you share a desk. So there's obvious efficiencies that come out of that. And this is the first sketch we did, which seemed kind of crazy for the desk. But we looked at, we cleared an existing space out and reused a lot of rooms around the edges, but we bulldozed the old space out of the middle, and that gave us an opportunity to have the desk. But then we looked at the circulation paths, and we figured out that's the yellow lines where everyone would be moving, and then said, okay, when that happens, the table has to lift up. So we created a condition which became very interesting about how the table would create spaces underneath it, which were really for circulation, but actually became opportunities for meetings and things like that as well. That's the floor plan. And it has an expansion up to about 175 actually. And we tested it. Oops. Oh, what happened? Oh dear. Tech health. Something is. Sorry about that. We can get back out by ourselves, I think. Are we going to get to the... No, we don't want to go to the beginning. Yeah. Oops. Let's just see where that freshes up. We were there, weren't we? So the drawing of the table. We tested in physical models before we took it into the computer. And with photographing and physical models, you actually get this great sense of like, what would that space be like? It proved to be quite exciting. We didn't do yellow in the end, as I'm sure everyone was relieved to hear. And then we took it to the computer, and that's when it became really kind of fun, and kind of the granularity of the thing became very exciting. We had to have a structural engineer look at the structures of all these vaults, because there's liability around this, and the egg crate. And then the computer generated a number of parts. Everything had to be fit into tiny elevators to go up 7 floors in Midtown Manhattan. And I think there are 870 unique pieces to the table. So it makes kind of amazing pattern, all cut by robots. And this is I'm going to show you a movie of this as well, because it's kind of fun. The spaces that got created under the table.
When we're building content or technology, we're building for the internet age. There's no walls or divisions between commerce, culture, brands, people. We wanted to sort of live in that state and have everybody be mixed in together and be working in this communal, common sort of way. We didn't really mean to build like a giant crazy desk. We just wanted to do something that was going to work for us and be fun, but then we ended up here. I knew Clive from his work on Mother's office in London.
We got very, very excited about working with the Barbarian Group. And we very much wanted to use this metaphor of the table and expand it to the point where we could have one table that would kind of float through the room, a surface that would connect everyone. So we plotted the desire lines about how people would use the room, determined a kind of a pattern, almost like cow paths, connecting diagonally sometimes through the space. So the table simply lifts up in each of those occasions. The idea of shaping the table around people and around relationships was really fundamental.
When we designed how the departments would sit around the desk, there was a real sense of one department flowing into the other. And the way this space is organized is it gives people a lot of little pockets of places to go and have impromptu conversations and private meetings.
Let's talk about robots for a second. The desk was made by repurposed automotive robots with lasers on them. So there's like these giant robot arms that used to assemble cars in the 80s, and they're now repurposed for furniture design. So the designers used all kinds of futuristic software and then put data on a floppy disk that's fed into a robot. So it's all like tons of individual pieces, flat packed, individually numbered, and then kind of slotted together here.
For a long time, it just looked like complete chaos in here.
It might look as though it's been very much sculptured, but actually those are structural forces being represented through the wave depth. The perimeter of the table is about 1,100 feet long, nearly 4,500 square foot of floor area. It houses 125 people. It's made up of plywood and MDF. And the top surface has this incredible finish, which is an epoxy resin. And it's pretty much done in one continuous pour over about 2.5 days here in New York.
If you look at the cost of this construction versus just doing standard, built-out, open plan, it's actually more effective. You know, it's just simply not true that something amazing and delightful needs to cost more than something that is expected and dull.
It's been half a year now, and we have less meetings, we have shorter conversations, we make faster decisions. There's a certain lightheartedness to it that I think rubs off on the gang.
It makes me happy every day I walk in, and I feel really proud when people come in, and I think it demonstrates that we are the type of agency who puts making at the heart of everything they do.
So we tried to make it as practical as possible, and it also happens that the giant crazy desk is really practical for us, you know.
That's all part of being barbarians. It's kind of, thugs, rebels, kind of vandals, goths, the people who sacked Rome and who did very well off it. And Rome deserved to be sacked, by the way. So, of course, the question came up almost too late in the process was, what happens if the desk cracks? And it was Ben Palmer, the CEO, had this brilliant idea of something called kintsugi, which is a Japanese tradition about how you repair something that breaks. And it's so simple. It's you celebrate the breaking of something. And this is the application of gold dust into the glue to put something together. So we said, okay, as soon as it breaks, it's gold dust in the glue. I'm going to end on a slightly crazy project that we did for Flaunt magazine, which was about a feature that was merging Los Angeles's kind of culture with London's culture. And we proposed putting a blanket of workspace, a single-story workspace, right over the city of London. Completely ridiculous in many ways, but it was also a challenge to land use and the inefficiencies of cities today when it comes to workspace, which can be something incredibly fluid. And the idea here was that we'd remove the 2-hour commute from everyone because you just go upstairs to work into the giant workspace. Of course, it has some impacts on what London looks like. But we preserved the monuments. Thank you.
Thanks. Is this on? Yeah. We have time for some questions. I ask you to wait till you get the microphone in your hand so the recorder picks it up. You know what? Just shout it out and we'll repeat it. It's easier.
Clive, you've addressed the issue of acoustical privacy between individuals. How would you solve the problem of an individual who wants visual privacy in their open spaces?
I think it's all about configuration. There's definitely ways of making spaces where you can get visual privacy. I mean, I can think of instances where we've actually designed areas where you're not facing into crowds of open people, but you have more enclosed areas. There are parts of Macquarie Bank where you actually face right out of the building. There's different ways of handling it. I think that I know that there are a lot of sensitivities, particularly in the software engineering, about disruption and distraction. But I do believe that we can actually design for the problem and still actually maintain a level of openness. Bear in mind that we do suggest having a high degree of small enclosed spaces within all of our modern workplaces. We call them phone booths. Phone booths tend to range in size, but they can be pretty small, like real historic phone booths, or they could be the equivalent of 2 to 4 person meeting rooms. But that's a very important aspect of any workplace today. People need to get away, make private phone calls, et cetera, and those things should always be very accessible. So they're distributed. There's someone there as well. Yeah.
Okay, so I saw some low fidelity, small scale modeling going on the SuperDesk
Right.
Concept. Did you do any full scale prototyping, or is the work the prototype?
We didn't do any full-scale prototyping, but I think it's because we kind of dimensionally knew everything we needed to do. So we didn't feel that was a risk area, if you like. I mean, the desk is a normal height for the most part. There are parts where the desk is higher because it was important that there was a sit-stand component. But that was another advantage of having a flexible space that we just decided on a percentage of the space to be higher.
So you say that the culture is an important part of the design process. So the work seems to then sort of shape the culture in a certain way.
I think both shape each other. Wasn't it Winston Churchill who had a great saying that probably other people know, but might be able to say it better than me, something like that, we shape our buildings and then afterwards our buildings shape us. And it's so true. And that's part of our problem, because I think that we've been culturally shaped by buildings that are antiquated at the moment in terms of how they work. And we're in a completely new era where technology allows us to do completely different things. I built a desk in the house that I live in like 10 years ago, thinking, great, this is going to be my desk. I've got the computer, the screen, et cetera, et cetera. I've never used it. because we all have laptops, and lying on the sofa or in your bed or on a bar stool or something like that, you move. It sort of shocks me myself because I like big images, but even so. Sorry, I think that the one he was earlier. Yeah, you.
When you open a space up vertically and horizontally the way you do, what problems do you get with HVAC systems, and how do you solve them?
They haven't proven to be a problem. I think one of the reasons is the more space is opened up, the less problem you have with bad air and things like that. We know from working in warehouses that when we first did warehouse projects, we thought the 25-foot spaces were going to give us some problems, but they don't really. The heat tends to sit higher up, and the lower areas tend to stay much more temperate. There is a design aspect to it, of course, from an HVAC point of view, but we haven't really had problems in that area. Yes?
Color seems obviously very important to you. I wonder if you have some theories of what colors go with what kind of rooms or what kind of activities, and what is that based on?
Good question. We first started getting heavily into color mainly because of cost. It was the cheapest way to get kind of a variation or change in effect. And I think within shared public areas, being able to have some liberty with color is a good thing. But there's also, you also need to be respectful of where people are spending more time in more private spaces and things like that. We don't tend to put a lot of color necessarily into things like meeting rooms. Although occasionally we might, because it can be nice to have a variety of choice. I think variety and choice in a workplace is always something that we feel is very, very important. To get away from kind of a monolithic design solution. Yes?
I've never worked at a giant desk. It looks good. But when you do laboratory space, where do I put my oscilloscope and players?
I wouldn't recommend it for a laboratory space. You have to. I think you have to realize. Look, there's as your point is suggesting, there's a criticality to certain types of work, and you need to be able to define that criticality. And that is, a laboratory is a laboratory. There's actually a simplicity about a workspace, a desk-type workspace today. We're used to seeing cubicles and things like that look far more accessorized and kind of almost car-like than they need to be. And today, you really just need a work surface, something to put your laptop on. And that changes the whole equation. You don't really need barriers. You do get some privacy from bigger monitors and things like that for people. We work ourselves in an incredibly open environment, and we don't find it distracting at all. We find behavior changes with people. They don't talk as loudly. It really depends. There's a kind of an ecology to every kind of workplace, and it has to do with the people. It has to do with the numerical size. It has to do with the volume of space, the horizontal extent of the space, because large communities can generate white noise by themselves, and that's something that can mitigate issues of distraction. We've had more problems, I think, with, let's say, working with software engineers when there are only 12 of them in a room, sometimes, or 5 of them in a room, because they can disrupt each other, because there isn't any white noise. Any noise is a sudden moment of sound. So as I said, there's a sensitivity and an ecology to all of this stuff, I think.
Last question? Can I do a follow-up?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you do your workplace, what's your analysis process in terms of the actual user experience? Have you gone back? You must have gone back and done some research and some data acquisition around that.
Yeah, our clients are not often into the costs of post-occupancy evaluations, but we kind of do that on a informal level. GLG was more open to that, and that is that's great feedback that we got, which we captured in the video. We like to involve users as much as possible, so we like to have a very enlarged and intensive early stage with interacting with the client at the at the senior and the more junior level. And we do surveys and we do focus groups and things like that. Because really what comes out of that, prior to thinking of any kind of design, is what is the kind of the blueprint for the building. It's how everyone's going to interact with each other and what kind of facilities they're going to have. And then the design itself really comes after that. We don't like to walk into a project and say, hey, what about this great idea? In a sense, we were a little bit lucky with Barbarian Group that an idea that had been brewing just happened to work perfectly for them and they were open to it. But usually it's a much more intensive process and not such a simple solution. Any more questions? Thank you very much, everyone.